That iconic piece of music composed by Harry Manfredini isn't at the level of Star Wars, Jaws, or Psycho as far as fame goes, but who doesn't recognize it? You hear that, and you think an angry goalie is coming after you. And since this undead stalker never lets up, you better be caffeinated if and when he turns his attention your way. Well, we have a sponsor who can help you out with your caffeine needs, and they are Sparkplug Coffee. They've got the freshest, fairly traded, premium Arabica beans in our home and native land of Canada. Our American friends will, just like Canadians do, get their order shipped within a week, although us north of the border dwellers can enjoy free shipping. Free. That's not scary. As far as what you'll get, there are so many options, including half calf and decaf, in case you don't feel a need to load up on the calf before you do battle with a pissed-off goalie. Sparkplug has many, many blends and roasts, including rotating seasonal blends. You become a member, and you'll be so happy because you can customize to get your orders when it suits you. So this is nothing like a typical Coffee of the Month club that'll just send you stuff even when you don't need it yet. And a membership will get you perks and deals that some rando, well, just won't get. Oh my God, the cops are after Jason. They won't win. They never win. And you memberinos will save money on every order. Buy it, Mommy. Buy it. Buy it, Mommy. And kill her. Let's get those fingers working. Type sparkplug.coffee/HYES and then you'll save 20% off the next order you make, whether it's the first time you've bought stuff from the plug or the 51st. Our HYES promo code, HYES, keeps some bills in your wallet just in case you feel like investing some of it into opening up a summer camp in a notorious location. Okay, our bloody business has been transacted. It's time to hear about a whole series of bloody motion pictures. And action! Have you ever seen Friday the 13th? How about that score? This is the third episode this month so far. Thank you again, Andrew Luther, for your creepy horror theme for us this month. So hello, you undead serial killers, and thanks for not picking up my sleeping bag and bashing it against a tree. But thanks also for downloading, streaming, or YouTubing the 541st bloody dose of Have You Ever Seen? This channel does spoiler-filled reviews of classic films, usually ones that are more reputable than what I'll be talking about today. Since it's a Friday, the 13th in fact, this talk will be handled by just one man today. My wife Bev is off at work during this spooky day. But Ryan Ellis here is on the job to give you my thoughts about all 12 movies in this long-running series. When I do these solo shows, the format is a little different than when I'm talking to Bev. In my monologues, I break down the plot sequentially. I try to make you smile or maybe even laugh out loud with some tomfoolery, such as when I do middling impressions of famous people. I also ask plenty of reasonably good questions to make you think. Makes you go, Although today, even that's not going to be my MO. What I'll be doing is giving my overall impressions of the flicks in the entire Friday saga, movies that I'm neither ashamed of nor proud to say I've seen multiple times each. I won't be fully reviewing any of them, but going over the broad strokes and getting into the weeds about box office and critical reception. I've also got a few memories to share of when I saw the first one, and even some thoughts about the promotion of when this son of a bitch took Manhattan. So the one that started it all, Friday the 13th, was directed by Sean S. Cunningham and was released by Paramount on May 9th, 1980. The Seanster only directed the first one, but he produced 4 more of them. Victor Miller and Ron Kurz were scribes for this first one, at least. Friday had a very small budget, but raked in close to $40 million. It was also 18th at the worldwide box office that year, not even $100,000 behind the beloved comedy Caddyshack, and not even $5 million less than Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. That surprised me, but this may shock you as it shocked me. A Friday the 13th movie has a fresh tomato on Rotten Tomatoes. 63%, baby! Their average is just shy of 6 out of 10. Yet it was up for Razzie Awards for Worst Director and Worst Supporting Actress. Betsy Palmer as Mrs. Voorhees was, yes, a nominee for Worst Supporting Actress. What she does in the finale is high camp and ridiculous, but it's also maybe the most iconic 10 minutes in the entire fucking series. Kill her, Mommy! Kill her! If Daniel Day-Lewis had played Mrs. Voorhees, he would have done pretty much the same thing and probably would have been up for an Oscar for it, and you'd have to call him Pamela, even when they weren't shooting. On the flip side of those Razzie noms, the American Film Institute honored 2 of the Friday flicks with nominations, although neither one was actually on an AFI list. The original was up for the top 100 thrills, and the third one, the one where Jason first gets his goalie mask, was a candidate for the top 50 villains. Incidentally, Freddy from the Nightmare on Elm Street flicks was 40th on the villains list, 4-0, which you could argue is him representing the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost of slasher films, meaning, if you never heard this before, Michael Myers is the Father, Jason Voorhees the Son, and Frederick Krueger is the Holy Ghost. Unholy Ghost, I guess. I could see why they didn't put all three of the deranged monsters on the list, because that's a lot of serial killers in 50 slots. And if only one of them was going to make it on there, then a wise-ass Freddy was probably the best choice. Plus, you couldn't have Michael or Jason on there because the AFI voters had to make room for Man from Bambi. I saw the first Friday on videotape back in, I guess, 81, 82. My uncle, my aunt, and my two cousins, who lived about 2 hours away from us, were staying with us for a few days because their oldest son had a hockey tournament in the area. So on the Friday night, I think it was the Friday, we kids went to the video store to rent a flick. My cousin Jason, not the one I've mentioned in another podcast, but a different Jason, this one's on my mom's side, decided we needed to rent the original Friday. If I'm right, and that was 81 or 82, then I was either 7 or 8 years old. Even if it was 83 or 84, I was 9 or 10, which is still too fucking young to be watching something like this. What was with our parents allowing this to happen? My sister and my cousin are both older than me by a couple of years in his case and 1 year in her case, but still, what the hell? Bev and Chris have both talked in our podcasts, so Chris from Scoring at the Movies, my defunct sports movie podcast, about how hard it is to scare me now. But it wasn't then. When Annie gets her throat cut out in the woods about, maybe 15 minutes in, I was done. I didn't leave the room. I let everyone watch it without me, though. FOMO! Oh, and by the way, reminding myself here by reading the plot description on Wiki, Annie is the camp's cook. So she's the first one who was killed in the course of this horrible weekend. And who did it? Crystal Lake's former cook, who's an old friend of the Christies. I think it was professional jealousy as much as it was insane rage. Took my job. You took my job. So anyway, back to that story about the first Friday at our house. I just turned my back and played with my G.I. Joes for the next hour or so. I could hear everything, and I might have turned around to see some of it. I don't remember for sure. Oh, wait. I think I did see Mrs. Voorhees' head get chopped off, which fucked me up all over again. I also remember when my cousin Jason, my sister, and I had to go down to the basement to get sleeping bags because the three of us were racking out in the living room upstairs that night. And we got down and back upstairs so fast. The killer might have been down there. Isn't it funny also, of course, his name, my cousin, Jason. And what I also remember vividly is the next morning, during a very bright day, a bunch of them were watching the movie again. So this time I did see Seaweed Jason leap out of the water and lunge for Adrian King. As great as that scare is, I don't remember being as messed up by that as I was by the gore the night before. Maybe it was because it was a sunny morning. Horror movies, of course, play better when it's dark. And that last scene, by the way, is still a great jump scare. It wasn't even in the script, but the makeup man Tom Savini figured out how to make a young boy look like a deformed lake monster. Then they had him leap out of the water for that one last scare. I think Sean Cunningham even admitted they were blatantly ripping off Carrie when Sissy Spacek reaches up through a pile of rocks to grab Amy Irving's arm at the end. What I've always found so smart about the one in Friday, too, is that Adrian King has her hand dangling just above the surface of the water in the foreground. Nice music is playing, gentle, seems like everything's fine, but why are we seeing this? It also looks dreamlike. And it suggests something will come up to grab her by that hand. But no, it's from behind. But was it just a dream? It wasn't Carrie. In this, they left it open for the sequels we would get nearly every year for the rest of the 80s. I'm not sure they knew they'd do a sequel at that point, though, because Halloween is one of the reasons this movie got made, and it didn't have a sequel yet. So I don't know if they were thinking sequel, but it's set up for one. As illogical as it is, when the mother's got her head cut off and the boy should have been dead from a drowning. When I finally saw the entire movie again many years later, and I've seen it at least 3 times, I came to realize that this one is actually a pretty good mystery, a good whodunit. Because who is killing these teenagers, and why? They might be annoying young adults, but they don't deserve to get butchered. Well, maybe a little. So when we find out the who did it and her motive, you don't have to agree, but at least it makes some kind of sense in a sick way. She's murdering what she thinks are sex-obsessed kids. Jason drowned because counselors were not paying attention to the children. 2 of them were off having sex, so naturally, Mama V thinks all camp counselors should die for their mistake. I have my issues with young people too, now that I'm 49, Pam, but ease up a bit. And as over-the-top as Betsy Palmer is in the first Friday, I think she does a pretty good job playing what seems at first to be a nice, normal woman who then proves to be a raving loon. Until she runs up against Alice, who cuts her fucking head off. The effect isn't as good when you see the strings or just watch it many times. For one thing, it's clearly a man's hands flailing about, reaching for its severed head. I think even Tom Savini is the one who's the hands. But it's a great kill nevertheless. Very slow motion too, as I recall. Zack Snyder must have loved the first Friday, because also the Jason scare at the end is slow motion. Siskel and Ebert rained urine all over the original, and I think all of the movies in this franchise for that matter, but they're wrong, at least about the first one. It's a pretty great slasher flick. It's not as good as Halloween, which is part of the reason why this got made at all, but I'll watch Cunningham's flick again someday. I've seen Halloween a lot. I covered it a few days ago. Might not watch that one again for a little while. I didn't actually watch any of the Fridays to do this review, by the way. I'm basing these thoughts on memories and a lot of research online. But if it's free somewhere later this month, I'll peep at the first one. If nothing else, I got to see them kill a snake. Take that, snake! And I could see a pre-throat punctured Kevin Bacon wearing a skimpy bathing suit. He, by the way, did not appear in the making of they did a couple years ago, that long making of. I think Bacon's probably ashamed that this was his first movie, but it was. No, that's not true. Animal House was his first movie, or one of. Okay, so the second Friday. Steve Miner took over as director, and his sequel was released 51 weeks later, on May 1st, 1981. Paramount more than doubled the budget, and the picture did very well, considering they still weren't fronting much to make it. Still, Part 2 made quite a bit less than the first one, ending up at a haul of around $22 million. That ranked it 35th at the box office that year, although it made more than some pretty well-respected horror titles like The Howling and Scanners. Halloween 2, however, outdid Friday by about $3.5 million. They killed off the final girl from the first flick in the opening scene and this flick, so Alice was out and Amy Steele as Ginny was in. And of course, Jason's the one that finds Alice, and what does he do to her? Puts a knife in her head, or a pin, or he doesn't have the machete, I don't think. So we had a mostly new cast, and of course the villain went from being Jason's mother to Jason himself. Crazy Ralph did return, didn't he? And somehow Jason's alive after all these years, after supposedly drowning in the lake. He got wet out there in the lake, you know. Pamela is a factor as Jason's driving force to kill all these punk teenagers, though. And Betsy Palmer does have a credit on IMDb, but I don't remember if they shot any new footage with her. I think the living dead man just imagines he sees her, and they use stock footage. Jason doesn't have the hockey mask yet. He wears a sack over his deformed face in this one, and he's far from supernatural the way he is in the later ones. Unless you count the fact that he's alive at all. I think in the 2009 remake they suggest that he never did drown at all, but the young version of himself surfaced, without being seen by anyone, mind you, and went off to live alone in the woods. Which is almost more insane than him being alive again after he got water in his lungs when he was a little boy. This little kid lived by himself in the woods for that long? Basically, though, the man keeps coming back to life just because the filmmakers want him to. You can't say they just rehashed the original movie like so many sequels do, though. After all, the heroine in number 1 is pushing up worms not 10 minutes in, while the killer is only an influence on the bad guy this time. All Jay has is her chopped off head, her sweater, and his memories. Memories, and what's that song again? The Way We Were? Memories of the way we were. But at the end, Jason is fooled by Ginny, who puts on Pam's disgusting sweater and pretends to be Mrs. Voorhees before she manages to get his machete away. All those S's again. Manages to get his machete away from him and chop him in the shoulder. Okay, machete's not an S, but it sounds like one. Oh, I didn't tell you that the critics weren't as kind as the ticket buyers were this time. Only 29% of Tomatoes people gave it a good review. The average is 4.4 to 10. This was also up for Worst Sequel at the Stinkers Bad Movie Awards. Steve Miner also directed the third 13th, which was in 3D. As I recall, they took some advantage of that with the gory visual effects. Jason comes at the camera at one point with his arms outstretched. Paramount put Part 3 in theaters on August 20th, 1982. The budget went up a little more, and the box office receipts were back up almost to what the first one made, about 35 million smackers. That meant it ended up 21st at the box, outdoing films that have gone on to become legendary, like Sophie's Choice, Blade Runner, and Fast Times at Ridgemont High. But the flick that Friday 3 really outdid was Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, which was only 53rd at the box and made about $20 million less than Steve Miner's second sequel. But still, the critics absolutely hated this effort. It's only got 7%, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on Rotten Tomatoes, and the average is 3.7 out of 10. I think it was this one where Leonard Maltin's review said something like, "Enough already." Dana Kimmel plays Chris, the third different final girl in 3 movies, and she acts as Jason in the head, which is why his hockey mask has a big cut in it in future installments. Old Jake does get the mask in this one, because one of his victims introduced it by trying to scare one of the girls. Richard Brooker makes for a pretty intimidating version of Jason this time. Warrington Gillette, by the way, played him in Part 2. The movie ends with our man laying dead in a barn, even though Chris has a vision of the rotting corpse of Mrs. Voorhees leaping out of the water and dragging Chrissy out of the canoe in which she passed out. That's a double ripoff because this movie rips off the first Friday after that ripped off Carrie. And this series is going to rip itself off again. We'll get to that. The studio didn't give us a Friday flick in 1983, but they released the 4th installment on Friday, the 13th, in April 1984. That was the first time they positioned one of these on that actual day, but it wasn't the last. You'd think they would do that every time, but what do I know? Joseph Zito was the man directing what a lot of people consider to be the best sequel, and to many it's the flat-out best Friday flick of them all, including the first one. Zito went on to direct Chuck Norris a couple of times, so maybe he dealt with horror in a different way as his career progressed. I don't know why I'm ragging on Chuck Norris. I really don't have an opinion either way about the guy. Anyway, Friday 4's budget was about the same as what Part 3 had, but The Quiet Zombie was watched by slightly fewer people. It made just shy of $33 million, so it was 26th as far as how much money it made that year, but it grossed around $7 million more bucks than the original A Nightmare on Elm Street did in 1984. And I will be comparing Friday, Nightmare, and Halloween's grosses a lot more as we go along, especially when obviously when they're in the same year. The final chapter was savaged by critics, although at least it got up to 24% on Rotten Tomatoes compared to 7% for the previous one. The average rating for Part 4 is 4.3 out of 10. This is the one where Crispin Glover does a funky dance and Corey Feldman goes feral on Jason at the end of the movie. In fact, this is the first time that the final girl isn't the one who murders the killer. It's the final boy who tricks the J-Man into stopping his assault on Tommy's sister, Tommy, of course, Corey Feldman, when Tommy quickly cuts and shaves most of the hair off his head to look like young Jason. We're the same. Split right down the center. It's like Batman and Catwoman. Oh, and you could argue that I'm wrong to say that Kimberly Beck, who plays Trish, Tommy's older sister, didn't grease the baddie. She's the one who wallops him with his own machete, then he falls on it and his skull crumples as the blade slices through the left side of his stupid old head. Pretty good effect, actually. It doesn't look that real when you see it multiple times. The first time, pretty effective. Tommy's attack, I guess you could say, is what really ends Jason's life, though, when he picks up the machete and slices and dices Voorhees, yelling, "Die! Die! 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 Die!" And here's some interesting facts about Glover and Feldman. They were both a year away from being in iconic films, Back to the Future for Crispin and The Goonies for Corey, so that gives the final chapter a lot more cachet in retrospect because it was at least partly a jumping-off point for two pretty major players in the second half of the 80s. Glover had Back to the Future, but also River's Edge and At Close Range in his near future. I like At Close Range quite a lot. Well, the mid-80s belonged to Feldman. After this and The Goonies, he did Stand By Me in 86 and The Lost Boys in 87. Plus, I still have a soft spot in my heart for the two Coreys in License to Drive, which I don't think I've seen since I was a kid, when I loved it, and I think Bev's a big fan of Dream a Little Dream, which she loved as a kid. I don't like that one so much. Oh, and one more thing about Feldman is that he was in Gremlins the same year as the final chapter, a big hit that we covered a few Christmases ago. Because money is nice, Part 4 wasn't really the final chapter in this gruesome story. While Jason was finally dead at the hands of that bald young psycho Tommy Jarvis, the killings continued in Part 5, A New Beginning, which Leonard Maltin, I believe, said was a creative way to get back into the series. Is it really all that creative? I think the studio intended to leave Jason dead for good, lest they go to the well so many times that people stop wanting to be bothered seeing the same guy killing a new batch of horny youngsters in slightly different ways while they're up there at the lake. Jason would be back, but I just don't think that was the plan at this point in 1985. Danny Steinman directed A New Beginning, which hit the streets on March 22nd, 1985. The budget was about the same as what the last few flicks were given, but the take was down to about 22 million pieces of coin. Where was it on the top 50 at the box that year? Only 41st. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 made about $8 million more, so the two franchises flip-flopped. Freddy not only wanted revenge on a bunch of stupid kids, he wanted revenge on Jason for outdoing him the year before in his first movie, Freddy's first movie. As for the Rotten Tomatoes numbers, they were even worse than what the final chapter had. Only 18% of critics like it, and the average is 3.7 out of 10, although the numbers aren't that different considering Part 4 is often called the best sequel, while no one would say that Part 5 is. Sorry, Denny Steinman, but your movie just isn't as memorable as the one that came before it, or a few others in the series, and yet surprisingly, the numbers aren't way off considering. What this one does have is a copycat killer, a character who barely matters to the plot, some dude named Roy. His son Joey had been killed by a patient in Tommy's asylum. Thank God for Wikipedia, because I forgot these details. So Roy decided to make people pay for it, even though they had nothing to do with Joey's death. So it's the storyline in Part 1 all over again, except it's a crazy man rather than a crazy woman, looking for vengeance about what happened to their kid. This is one reason I didn't bother looking up who wrote all these movies, because a lot of the time they're just reworking what the two guys did with the first screenplay. I do like what happens at the very end, though, because they set it up that Tommy is going to become the new Jason. The last shot has him brandishing a knife and wearing the hockey mask that Roy was using in this, suggesting he's about to kill the girl who has her back to him in his hospital room. I think it's a nurse or something. And then he'd probably forget how to talk and then turn into an indestructible monster later on down the road. But they bailed on that idea in the next one. Tommy was just a heroic character in Part 6, like the kid version was in Part 4. I understand the demand was for Jason to come back, but they supplied us with a reasonable lead-in to another way to do these things. You've got someone who suffered a horrible trauma and saw many people killed by the masked maniac. Then the kid goes insane and decides to become a killer himself. It made sense. But no, people wanted Jason back. Back, back, back. Money, money, money. The next one was Part 6, also known as Jason Lives. The mad motherfucker is back after a now teenage Tommy and a lugnut friend of his named Alan accidentally resurrect Jason's wormy corpse. It's a pretty stupid idea to have Tommy stab the clearly dead Jason in the heart with a spike. Then lightning hits the spike and brings the zombie back to life again. The idiots even brought his fucking hockey mask to the graveyard because Tommy wanted to destroy that too, but instead they just brought it right to the Murdiddly-Urdler. Tommy has a lot in common with those people who get cheated on and then take love letters out to the forest to light them on fire, and then the goddamn forest burns down. As long as they got their closure, though. I need my closure. Which he didn't get. He made it worse. For some reason, despite the horrible press it would get to keep doing this, the money men keep reopening Camp Crystal Lake, so most of this movie, certainly the climax, is again set there. And here's a thought. If you could get the financing to reopen a kids' camp with this much baggage and bad press, then you must have confirmed that a lot of parents would send their kids there and probably even commit some money to doing it before you even really decide to reopen it. So either those parents never pay attention to what happens at that lake, or they're like the people who were still lining up to let their kids sleep over at Michael Jackson's after the news broke that he might have been a pedophile back in the early 90s. So maybe the real villains in this series are, yes, the people who keep trying to reopen the camp, but also anyone who would send their kid there. Anyway, Jason, who's played by C.J. Graham this time, Megan, she's Jennifer Cook, and Tommy, who's played by Tom Matthews in this one after being John Shepard in Part 5, I didn't mention that, are the main three characters in number 6. Tommy comes up with the bright idea that Jason has to die where he originally drowned, and after much effort, the two heroes do make that happen. Although the last shot proves that he ain't dead yet. Right before the credits roll, the asshole opens his eyes. Since he's just caught around the neck by a boulder-weighted chain after a boat propeller had already chewed on his neck, but he appears to be functioning, then why can't he just swim down a few feet, loosen the slack on the chain, then pull it off his neck and get back to bloody business? Those two are still right there on the dock. Go kill them. I make fun, but I actually remember liking the climax of this one more than a lot of them. Plus, there is a symmetry to having JV ending up back in the lake. Jason Lives was written and directed by Tom McLaughlin. McLaughlin? He went on to direct a few episodes of the Friday the 13th TV series, and he directed TV series and TV shows for decades, so other things, not Friday necessarily. His take on the Jake got a release date in early August 1986. The budget went up to about $3 million, but the Kill 'Em All was still very profitable, pulling in a little shy of $20 million. So it's way down from what the first and third made, but that's still quite a return on investment. If every movie earned more than 6 times its budget, studios wouldn't be complaining. They'd still try to cheat people who make movies and TV out of what they're owed, but they wouldn't be complaining. Okay, they would. Rich people always find a way to bitch. Anyway, Friday 6 ranked 46th in 86, and it did better than House and Psycho 3, but Cronenberg's The Fly and Poltergeist 2 made a boatload more. Incidentally, we plan to cover Psycho 2 at the end of this month, not 3, but 2, and we already did reviews of The Fly and the first Poltergeist. In fact, we tackled Poltergeist just last year in Scary Movie Month, while The Fly was one of our June chats in 2021. We called that Sci-Fi Month, I think it was. Could have been a horror movie, of course. It is a horror movie, but it's also sci-fi. As for the reviews for Jason Lives, they were actually not bad at all. On Rotten Tomatoes, this one was up to 50% with an average of 5.1 out of 10. John Carl Buechler, I guess it's Buechler, was behind the bullhorn for Part 7, although he worked in makeup and visual effects more often than directing in his career. His Friday film is better known as The New Blood, or probably even better known as Jason Meets Carrie. The heroine in this one is Lar Parr Lincoln, who plays Tina. She's got telekinesis, so that's her weapon against the silent psycho slasher. 3 S's in a row without a problem. How about that? This was Kane Hodder's first time behind the mask. He was the most menacing actor who ever played Jason, so when I think about this series, I think of him as the bad guy. Most people probably do, not just me. Hodder did another 3 of these, so he was on the hunt up to and including Jason X. He actually has a pretty awesome resume beyond playing Jason. He had a small role in a Robert Altman film, California Split, back in the 70s, and he was also in Under Siege, so that's the Seagal movie. He was in Daredevil, the Affleck film. People don't like it, but it's a pretty high-profile movie. And the one where Charlize Theron plays a serial killer, Monster. He was Victor Crowley in the Hatchet flicks. He played Ed Gein in a TV movie, the inspiration for Norman Bates in Psycho. And even though I normally don't name-drop video games, he even played Leatherface in a fucking video game. What a career. There was no Friday flick in 1987, so that means The New Blood was released on May 13th, 1988. And yes, that was a Friday. The budget was a bit lower than the previous flick, although you can't argue with it making about 19 million greenbacks on such a small investment. However, it was only 53rd at the box. At least the studio could be happy they made more money than The Return of Michael Myers did. This earned about 1.5 million more pieces of cash than Tall Mike did, and that was the first Halloween film that had been made in years. So you'd think there would be a lot more interest in that than there was in yet another Jason outing. A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, however, was 19th and made close to $50 million, so it way outdid Friday 7 and Halloween 4. The critical numbers were pretty bad for The New Blood. 35% of Rotten Tomatoes reviewers say it's worth seeing, and their average is 4.6 out of 10. As for the story, Tina uses her Carrie-type powers at Crystal Lake. Just nuke that camp, for God's sakes, nuke it! And she accidentally brings Jason back to life. In this one, old Jay gets shot, burned, whacked, hung, and I guess drowned again to snuff him out. For now. And it isn't even the girl with fucking superpowers that finishes him off. It's some dingleberry named Nick. Jason Takes Manhattan was the mostly inaccurate title of the 8th installment. Voorhees and his victims are only in the Great Big Apple for about a third of the movie. Most of the story takes place on a boat that's on the way to New York. Jason is brought back into the festivities this time when a houseboat disturbs some underwater cables, which shock Jason awake. He then sideshow bobs his way onto the boat and sings the HMS Pinafore with Bart. Now, he doesn't do that, but he does murder a lot of young people who maybe just wanted to see a Broadway performance, take in a peep show in Times Square, and walk around the big city. The moronic ending has Jay getting drowned in toxic waste. Then he somehow turns back in what he was as a boy? A lot of horror movies have had dumb endings, but this is one of the dumbest that ever dumbed. For him to die as a kid again is bad enough, but do they let toxic waste flow in the sewers in any city, even at night? Especially when citizens can just wander down there and get splashed by it? Jensen Daggett as Rennie and Scott Reeves as Sean, iconic names, are the final two this time. I guess you could say that Rennie is the one who actually killed Jason because she threw waste in the monster's face, although what really finished him off was that tidal wave of toxicity down in the sewer that she had nothing to do with. Yeah, this one's terrible, but there is that great fight scene where some young guy punches Jason in the mask about 250 times in a row. Then JV just rears back and knocks the kid's head clean off with one return punch. That's also dumb, but it was a classic moment in this series. Rob Hedden had written and directed on the Friday TV series before this. Well, he wrote and directed this movie as well, which saw the light of day on July 28th, 1989. The studio upped the budget to about 5 million simoleons, but the payoff was worse than it had been for the last few, making only about 14 mil. That had to be a rude awakening. You take Jake to a different locale, you put more money into his movie, but fewer people gave a shit. Well, it was bad, that's why. It was only 70th at the box office, although a Friday picture could brag again about one-upping Halloween. The Revenge of Michael Myers was only 76th and made about 3 million fewer coins than Friday 8 did. On the other hand, A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Dream Child, and The Fly 2, which weren't exactly phenomenons themselves, both made considerably more than the J-Man or Michael did. And the critics said nope. Jason Takes Manhattan has a mere 11% fresh reviews on the Tomatoes, with a putrid average of 3.3 out of 10. What I'll always remember about this one, though, is when Kane Hodder was interviewed by Arsenio Hall on the Arsenio Hall show starring Arsenio Hall. Hodder came out in full costume with the goalie mask and everything, and he sat on the couch and said absolutely nothing. Many questions, zero answers. Nervous laughter from the audience. You have to admire commitment to your character because Hodder must have been dying to just be interviewed the normal way by a late-night talk show host. And Arsenio was big at that point in history. He was very zeitgeisty. And he was fun. He was cool. Yet here was Kane playing his part. And some kudos are due to Arsenio for being in on the joke, but playing it straight. Although making it a joke might have been a mistake because you should be afraid of the guy who machetes people, not snickering at him in a talk show. I guess the series was already becoming self-referential, though, and they might as well have done something like this to promote their shitty movie, which was self-referential. By the late 80s, Jason, Michael, and Freddy were becoming the heroes of their own movies. They slaughtered many, but were now beloved as classic characters. So Jason went to the big city and he didn't like what he found there. Then he went to HE Double Hockey Sticks 4 years later, which was the 9th entry in the series. Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday was Adam Marcus's directorial debut. He got writing credit for the story as well. And his film came out 30 years ago, on August 13th, 1993. And yes, Virginia, that was a Friday. New Line had acquired the rights to the franchise by this point, partly so they could do a crossover movie, which I'll get to in a minute. The budget was back down to $3 million, but the Hell one barely outdid the Manhattan one, making about $16 million in total. That means it ended up 85th worldwide, although it at least did quite a bit better than horror shows like Leprechaun and Children of the Corn 2. Small victories for the mass murderer. Another win is that this was up for several Fangoria Chainsaw Awards, including for a couple of the actors and for the screenplay, although it didn't win any of them. Rotten Tomatoes continued to shit on these Friday movies. Only 16% of reviews are positive, although the average is really not that bad considering that 16% figure. It's 4.3 out of 10. And that suggests, as a lot of these Rotten Tomatoes reports have, that while some people must just trash these Fridays, others might think they're not too bad. Roger Ebert might give it a dud rating or possibly 1 star, while others are saying 2.5 or even 3 stars, to get the average up as high as some of them are. I'm not saying the reviews have almost ever been very good for these movies, but 16% positive reviews is not a truly fair indication of what the clump of critics really thought of it, or some of the other ones either. How Jason was resurrected this time is anyone's guess. He's just there, back in Camp Crystal Lake, not a little boy in a Manhattan sewer anymore. I do remember the early scene, though, where a woman, an FBI agent in disguise, mind you, probably hot, I forget that part, but probably, gets him to follow her into an ambush. Then the FBI basically explode him. But then he comes back to life again. There's possession in this one, and demons, and mysticism, and all kinds of other weird shit, which comes to an end with demonic hands pulling Jason down into you-know-where. A big kudo is due to that last great shot where Freddy's razor claw comes out from the ground and pulls the goalie mask down. Setting up a showdown that would happen 10 years later. Wes Craven made a new Nightmare in the meantime, which a lot of people think is the best Nightmare flicker show, so he had something going on, but still he wasn't going to fight Jason for a long time to come. As for the mute goalie, he slumbered for nearly 9 years. Then Jason X came out in late April 2002, although that was when it saw the light of space over here. Spain and Cameroon got it at the end of 2001, so when I talk about the money it made in a few minutes, it'll be listed under 2001 totals. Anyway, this was indeed the one where Scary Jay goes into space and becomes Uber Jason. Pretty cool poster, by the way, but then a lot of these did have cool posters. James Isaac had been working on creature effects in things like Return of the Jedi and Gremlins before somebody let him direct a movie. This was one of only 4 he ever did direct. He shot the film here in Toronto, which is probably how they got David Cronenberg, of all people, to act in it. Can you imagine a Friday the 13th flick directed by Cronenberg? The skulls, the bodies, you give it all such a glow. I don't know if it's art, but I like it. Jason 10 was the only entry that you can call a true box office failure. It cost 11 million pieces of currency to produce it, but only brought in 17 million worldwide. 1-7. If you can't at least double your budget, you ain't making money. So this pile of puke there was 139th around the world, although those figures are weirdly skewed since its release date was so different in different parts of the world. Yeah, that's why it's failed. A weird release pattern. That's why. The critical response was very shitty. Just 19% of Rotten Tomatoes critics say it was worth your time, with an average of 3.8 out of 10. What happened in this thing? I don't know. JV gets frozen in a cryogenic pod and sleeps for over 400 years or something like that. Then he wakes up in the future and kills people on a spaceship. This one got really self-referential, although I remember chuckling at some of it. Were we just long past the point of these things trying to be scary, though? Yeah, probably ever since the Big Apple visit. That got meta, and Jason wasn't at all frightening anymore. Hell, he was more cool than he was scary. But things turned around for the franchise because 2003's Freddy vs. Jason became one of the best-known and best-liked Voorhees flicks. It came out 20 years ago in the middle of the dog days of August 2003. Director Ronnie Yu and the hip young cast helped the two supervillains make about $116 million worldwide on a budget of about $30 million. I think I read that they wanted someone even bigger than Kane Hodder this time, so 6'5" Ken Kirzinger played Jason, and of course Robert Englund played Freddy. Kelly from Destiny's Child is also in this, and for a non-actress, I remember she wasn't dreadful. I think she's even one of the last victims left alive. That $116 million gross worldwide means it was 52nd at the box. It outgrossed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake by about 9 mil, and was far ahead of crapola like Dreamcatcher and Jeepers Creepers 2. God, I hated Dreamcatcher. If Morgan Freeman has ever been worse in a movie, I wouldn't like to hear about it, actually. Don't tell me, please. I don't want to know. He was so bad. The whole movie was so bad. I had to pee so bad, but I thought something has to happen to this to make it sort of worthwhile. And it didn't. The reviews for Fred's fight with Jay weren't awesome, but 41% and a 5 out of 10 average are better than what most of the sequels in the series got. And when the two bad guys finally do fight, it's pretty cool. I didn't love the scenes without those two guys, which I bet is what everyone else thinks too. Let's just get the two unkillable maniacs to kill each other. You just have to wait a long time for that to happen, which I guess I understand. You can't just have them square off in the first 5 minutes and that's that. Awards-wise, FVJ was up for some Fangorias and won a trophy for the makeup and creature effects. The plot is fairly creative, which probably tracks considering Ronnie Yu was involved. He had directed Bride of Chucky a few years earlier. You don't have to like that one to admit it was a fresh idea on the Chucky story, and that was self-aware just as this was. Yu also did Fearless with Jet Li. I'm not the biggest Jet Li guy, but I really like Fearless. Anyway, that plot. Freddy somehow resurrects Jason again, who then goes on a kill-crazy rampage that people think is Freddy's doing, which is what Fred wants. You empower Freddy when you think and talk about him. Sort of like Trump. The teenagers in this one managed to tranquilize Jay for a while and drive him out to Crystal Lake, so he can pull Freddy from the dream world into the real world in order to beat him up. So it's the plotline of the first Nightmare on Elm Street without Nancy, but with Jason. Maybe it isn't as creative as I thought. But yeah, the two bad guys beat the shit out of each other in the climax until Laurie, the Monica Keena character, cuts Freddy's head off. Clean off. Of course that happens, but the very last shot is of Jason emerging from the lake carrying Freddy's severed head, which winks at the camera. Well, his eye winks, but you got what I'm saying there. I guess Jason is going back to his Part 2 roots, where all he had left were a severed head, a ratty sweater, and his sweet, sweet memories. So yes, Jay won this round, you won this round, but the brawl looked like it would continue sometime in the near future. It's a little surprising that the child molester and the drowning victim could do that well at the box office, and then we didn't see either serial killer again, together or apart, for another 6 years. That was in 2009, although Freddy's next movie, the remake with Jackie Earle Haley, didn't come out until 2010. Jason and Freddy never had been on screen together again. I bet the audience would turn out if they found even a moderately good reason to pit them against each other for round 2, but so far, nope. Nope. There's a cheap plug for our review on Monday. Nope. The 2009 reboot was the third Friday flick in a row that I saw on the big screen, and I thought it wasn't half bad. In fact, I liked it about as much as when Freddy lost his head and Jason got over his fear of the lake. The 2009 edition was certainly more realistic than most of the other sequels were. Jason's more of a loner, living off the land, defending his territory type maniac than he is a supervillain who can come back from the dead. The opening pre-title sequence is actually pretty excellent horror filmmaking, especially the last shot before they do run the credits after that long opening. Such a matter-of-fact kill. Boom, dead, credits. Opening credits. Derek Mears wore the mask in this one. Marcus Nispel directed it. He was coming off the highly successful Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake I just mentioned. Nispel's reboot was released on Friday the 13th in February of 2009. Ooh, Friday the 13th. I'm amazed they didn't put these things out on that day even more often than they did. It's a hell of a hook. The budget was back down to less than 20 million smackers this time, but it made over 91 million around the world. It was 67th at the global box office, making a little less than The Final Destination, so The Final Destination, not the first one, but the last one they called The Final Destination. But it outgrossed Orphan and Sam Raimi's Drag Me to Hell, even though those were thought of as far better horror movies than this was. The critics were, say it with me, not kind. Only 25% of them say they like this one, with an average of 4.2 out of 10. Although yet again, the average is quite a bit higher than the percentage. People have been saying for a while, but maybe Rotten Tomatoes is a fucked up website. Anyway, Friday 2009 won a Fangoria trophy, but that was for worst film of 2009, not for special effects or makeup or anything like that, and I'm saying I think that's very unfair. They've been treated very unfairly. The story in this one is mostly the silent villain murderizes hot young people one by one, the thing we've seen countless times in so many of the other sequels, although the acting is generally better this time. Jared Padalecki as Clay and Danielle Pennebaker as Jenna aren't Tracy and Hepburn, nor is Amanda Rigetti as Whitney, but they've got better chops than many of the scream queens and boy victims who populated the previous ones. I'm thinking of the girl who plays Kevin Bacon's girlfriend in the very first movie. Her pathetic scream as she just stands there waiting for, well, as it turns out, Mrs. Voorhees to just kill her, is one of the worst bits of acting I have ever seen. So the story in Nispel's flick is that Jason kidnaps Whitney after killing all of her friends in that opening I said I liked. Whitney reminds Jay of his mother, so that's why he saves and keeps her. We get hot sex between two very attractive people, most of them die, and then Clay and Whitney win, until the very last moment when Jason again bursts out of the lake and grabs Whitney. Dude leaps out of that fucking lake more often than sharks breach the surface of the ocean during Shark Week. Although rehash or not, the flick made bucks, as did the Freddy one that came before it. Only Jason X truly failed. Even it didn't hemorrhage money or anything, it just didn't cover the cost to make and market it. But the 2009 installment is as far as Jason has gone. It made more than 4 times its production budget, and yet they've never made another Friday, 14 years and counting. Next year, there will be a Friday the 13th in September and in December. The writers and actors strikes might fuck with release dates of all sorts of films, but Friday, September 13th, 2024 is the perfect time to put out the 13th Jason Flicker show. And if they do make another one, that'll mark 44 years after the first one. I did a review where I defended Rob Zombie's Halloween last year, which incidentally kicked off this trend of me doing solo shows on a regular basis. And now I come to the defense of at least some of these Friday films. And I'm not the only one. They've remained pretty popular after all these years. I don't think any kind of production company would make a long documentary about this or Nightmare on Elm Street the way they have, and in so doing pay the actors and directors to sit down and talk about their experiences and then market these things unless there was a demand for it, which means there probably still is one. And you might be wondering, why does a 49-year-old of moderate intelligence bother watching stuff like this at all, let alone rewatching them a few times each, and then spending this long talking about all of them? I'm not sure I have a good answer. I just like horror movies. Bev and I covered The Conjuring at the start of this month. I can't remember the last time she screamed so much at a movie or was that tense all the way through one. It worked pretty well on me, too. I finally saw Oppenheimer a few days later. It's an amazing accomplishment, and it's Nolan's best film in years. But which would I rather watch again tomorrow? Probably The Conjuring or one of the Friday flicks. So why do I and why do any of us put ourselves through the ringer watching people be terrified and often gutted? The real gutted, not when a 90-year-old celebrity who you haven't thought of in 15 years dies and you say, "I'm gutted" on Twitter. Maybe watching this stuff makes us feel alive, which is ironic considering the storyline is to massacre nubile youngsters. We also like to see a truly bad guy do bad things, often in cool ways, but then get beaten in the end. We see bad guys do bad things in reality all the time, but they're almost never punished for it. In movies like this, yes, these SOBs come back to life all the time, but when the film ends, usually Michael, or Jason, or Freddy are fried fucking chicken. Although I say that, and then I'm reminded of Harvey Dent and Batman's take on how if you live long enough, a hero will eventually be seen as the villain. In the case of the Halloween, Nightmare, and Friday franchises, these villains eventually became the hero, in a way at least. That's why we were going to the theater to keep watching the movies. Even though the numbers were down, these movies still were making money, especially the Friday films. We weren't going to see unknown teen actors stumble their way through often insipid dialogue. And look what happened when they tried to get away from Michael and Jason in the mid-'80s. People didn't want that. Audiences didn't like Halloween 3 or Friday 5 very much, so the studios went back to what worked before. And another part of it is that we're a fucked up society that gets off on gore. We also, whether we recognize it as this or not, love subtext. And these 3 slasher series, and many others I'm sure, if you fuck, you die. Or if you're arrogant or stupid or foolhardy, then you die. If you're honest and careful, and it helps if you're a virgin, then the killer will try to kill you too, but you will beat him before the credits roll. Only you can't truly defeat pure evil. Yeah, we kept getting so many Halloweens, Nightmares, and Fridays in the 80s and into the 90s. because they were cheap to make and usually raked in dollars. But there's also that exact notion. You can knock these guys down, but pure evil always finds a way to rise again. And I guess we find that entertaining. Also, certain things can trigger emotions in you instantly. I can say this with great confidence in this entire episode more than anything else probably. You don't have to like horror movies to recognize the music in Halloween, Elm Street, and the 13th. Unlike most people, I'm used to hear the Friday theme as ch 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 ha 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 ch 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 ha ha ha, even though it was always intended to be ki 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 ma 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 ki 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 ma ma ma, just like Pamela Voorhees says in the first movie, "Kill her, mommy, kill her." So it's ki ma. I think Harry Manfredini lucked into that repeating ki 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 sound effect on his keyboard, or am I thinking of the guy who wrote the X-Files theme? Well, maybe they both did. Anyway, however Manfredini came up with it, people know that tune. They know, and they probably recognize the music in A Nightmare on Elm Street too, which I can't hum for you right now, but I probably don't have to, do I? And how about the look of the killers? People dress up as these guys for Halloween even now, 45 years after Michael started killing people, around 40 years after Jason did, and 39 since Freddy did. The horror movies we've had in the past decade have often been extraordinary, and they're certainly better than anything in the Friday series. But do any of them have a musical note or a character design as memorable as what's in the 13th? Well, maybe some of them do, but not that many. And some of them are awesome movies. I love them. So as bad as some of these motion pictures got in all the three series, they've stuck in the minds of a lot of people, perhaps because of the costumes and the music and the creative kills. So that was my take on 12 Friday the 13th movies. And of course, Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street came up a lot too. Hell, I yapped about Halloween just a few days ago, so I hope I didn't repeat myself too much. I wrote most of this before I even started preparing Halloween, so it's possible I bunged that up by posting my monologue about John Carpenter's masterpiece before I sat down to talk about this 12-some. Anyway, on Monday we'll be taking a look at Jordan Peele's third motion picture. We covered Get Out and Us in years gone by. Us! His third one isn't as good as those, but Nope still has some great stuff in it, some pretty good thrills, and I just talked about subtext in the slasher flicks. Well, Nope has a lot of that too. So Bev will be here for that, but I'll be back in the chair again just 7 days from right now. I had to release this particular episode today for obvious reasons, rather than a week ago, and I normally would have. So let's get back to the every other week routine I established close to a year ago when I did the 2007 Halloween. So on October 20th, I'll be covering what I originally was going to do on October 9th, but then pushed it back because I realized while watching it that The Conjuring is so similar to The Exorcist. So that's what it'll be on the 20th next week. That could be a long one. If you like what I've said today, or any other day, tell me so. Rate it, write a review. Of course, following the show by subscribing can only make us more popular with other people. Also, subscribing means you'll never miss out when we post a new ep. Same with YouTube. Be a subscriber there and tell us what you think of our words. We're at HYES Ellis on the Tubaroo, or enter Have You Ever Seen into the search section on YouTube itself. Or if you subscribe, you can't miss us at all. To get in touch with us in the email way, try haveyoueverseenpodcast@gmail.com. As for tweeting, well, the Musk Man hasn't yet blocked us from using @MovieFiend51 and @BevEllisEllis, so look for us there. And I'll suggest you continue to drink or start drinking Sparkplug coffee. Using our HYES promo code gets you a 20% discount. The destination is sparkplug.coffee/HYES. Okay, thanks for your attention as I rambled on about Friday the 13th. However you behave on this odd, weird, crazy, scary horror day, make sure you watch your back in case some sex-hating motherfucker decides to stick a large bladed weapon into it and cut your head off with a machete.